This is another iRaw podcast.
A lot of humans seem to think of art as something that's the particular preserve of this kind of unique intention and creativity of humans. But then when you start to scratch the surface and look into different possible definitions of what art is, or at least what unites or constitutes artistic practices, it becomes more and more difficult to separate those from animal practices, or it seems more and more likely that what we call human art making relies directly on animal practices of movement and marking and engraving and ordering and disordering and that type of thing.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Herzenfelder. Straight away, I just want to say I'm sorry that this episode took a bit of time to get out to you. Unfortunately, the beginning of semester got a bit away from me. Things have just been nuts and crazy busy. I was in this really nice groove over the summer months and bam, September came. I felt like I blinked and it was there, and I've blinked and it's gone. But I'm finally getting to a groove again, so thank you for your patience. But I promise you that the wait for this episode was well worth it. Today we're speaking about animal art and aesthetics. And really, the more I think about it, this wasn't originally one of the concepts I thought we would unpack in season 2. But it's really one of the concepts we should be talking about because it's right on the fringe of what we consider to be the differences between human and animal experiences. Somehow we've reserved art as being this human experience, this human thing. And as you'll see in this episode today, that's not really the case. The more you look at it, the fuzzier it gets. And today I'm going to be speaking with Jeffrey Bussolini, who's the co-director of the Center for Feline Studies, as well as the Avenue B Multi-Species Center. He's also an associate professor at the City University of New York. And Jeffrey really just gave me so many interesting insights into thinking about arts and aesthetics, and in particular, the experiences of arts and aesthetics. And I suppose that's not too surprising because since 1995, he's been thinking about phenomenology, particularly the relationships between the spatial dimensions, ethological and social dimensions of feline to feline, as well as feline to human relationships. We had a really exciting and interesting conversation, and I think we touched on some fascinating components of art. And the more we got into it, we started to bring up all these different examples. And as those examples came in, I think it's just started to get more and more exciting. So I think art and aesthetics provide a really unique and interesting way of considering animals and their experiences. But I'm not going to give too much away in this little intro bit here. I think you need to listen to it and think through some of those ideas yourselves. I do have to say, however, unfortunately, we did run into some sound and technical issues. I don't know what went wrong, but from almost the get-go, we just had some sound disturbances. So you are going to hear a slight little bit of buzz throughout the episode. I'm sorry about that. I might not even, hopefully my editing skills are getting better and you might not even notice it, but I just wanted to forewarn you that it is there. And about halfway through the episode, something just went completely wrong and the call dropped. So you might notice there's a section where Jeffrey is speaking through 4 points, and we lose him, unfortunately, just before he gets into the 4th point. And the reason I did edit these together quite nicely, I was very proud of myself, but the reason you will notice that it has been edited is unfortunately the sound from prior to the drop is much better than the sound from after the drop. And that's particularly for when I'm speaking. Something seems to have just gone a bit wrong. There's a crackle. But it's not too bad because luckily I don't do the majority of the speaking and Jeffrey sounds wonderful. So I'm learning. I'm still learning, and I hope that you'll continue to be patient with me as I do so. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, for the very first time ever, I'm going to put out a call here and say, could you leave me a review? I never thought I would actually ask for reviews, but I guess you need to ask for them, right? If you're enjoying this, if you could stick out a review for me on any of the podcast platforms you listen to, that would be awesome. Okay, enough blabber from me. Let's get on with it. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Animal Turn, Jeffrey. It's so great to have you with me here today.
Thank you, Claudia. It's very nice to be here and to speak with you.
I know we had a bit of a mix-up. Originally, I was thinking I was going to talk to you about phenomenology, and then we kind of shifted and changed, and it's a thrill to be speaking to you today about aesthetics, art, and animals, which I'd never really thought about these in relation to animals at all. Is aesthetics your main area of interest?
That's a good question. I would say aesthetics is not my main area of interest, but I've been drawn kind of further and further into this area because of a keen interest about trying to understand animal artwork or animals as art producers. Like you mentioned, I originally started working on animal phenomenology or phenomenological approaches to studying animals and animal interactions. And that has unfolded to a kind of series of other paths. And one of them is this path about animals as artists, animals as art makers. So it's not really my main initial entree into this area, but it's something that's occupied more and more of my time and attention because it seems so fascinating and because it seems like such a vital aspect of animal activity and something that has both kind of been ever present, but also hasn't really gotten much attention as much as it should have.
Yeah, it's infinitely interesting. When I was putting together season 2 and some of the concepts I was thinking of for season 2, art didn't really come to mind. But when you think about experience and art, there's something almost like, obviously I'm not an artist and have no background in understanding art, but there's something that seems almost intangible about art or explaining what art is.
That's true. And seems like among aestheticians, they have fierce debates about what the definition of art is. And for lay people, there's probably thousands of different possible definitions of what art is or what constitutes art. So it's one of those kind of minefields. But I'm trying to think about what it's. I guess also one thing that's interested me in relation to animals all along, ever since I started studying animals and phenomenological approaches to animals, was the questions of all of these posited criteria of what was proper to the human, things that supposedly constituted absolute dividing lines between humans and other animals. And we know that many of those have been proposed over the years and that they've fallen aside, things like language or improvisation or creativity or culture. And art seems like it remains one of those kind of thorny barriers that a lot of humans seem to think of art as something that's the particular preserve of this kind of unique intention and creativity of humans. But then when you start to scratch the surface and look into different possible definitions of what art is, or at least what unites or constitutes artistic practices, it becomes more and more difficult to separate those from animal practices, or it seems more and more likely that what we call human art making relies directly on animal practices of movement and marking and engraving and ordering and disordering and that type of thing.
Wow, you said so many interesting things there, and I want to get straight into art. But before I touch on some of what you just said there, you mentioned that you came to understand animals and phenomenology, and made your way into studying or looking at art as part of animals and experience. How did you first, become interested in the world of animal studies?
That's a very good question. It's nice to reflect on. I've always been interested in animals as interlocutors or as a kind of social companions or social interlocutors for a long time. I grew up in New Mexico in the mountains, and so there were horses, and deer and that type of thing around. And we long had cats and dogs living with our family. And there were kind of coterie of other animals around that I referred to. But it wasn't until I was in graduate school, ironically, after I had moved to New York City, which is oftentimes treated as a place with less of an intense presence of animals, although that's not exactly true. Nowadays, we recognize there's a lot of animals in the urban setting. I was studying with Joan Stambaugh, a phenomenologist, a translator of Heidegger, and also a scholar of Zen. And she started to say to me, you can use these tools of phenomenology. She was also interested in Alfred Schutz and other people who were kind of more on the sociological side of the phenomenological envelope. She said, you can use these tools to think about interactions between animals and interactions between animals and humans. And that time I was living with a very interesting cat I had adopted, named Cat, in New York on Avenue B, kind of the inception of the Avenue B Multi-Study Center and the Center for Feline Studies. And I started to try to take Joan's advice and think about how these tools, phenomenological tools of thinking about interaction and relationship, can apply as much in relations between non-human animals, and they can really illuminate interactions between humans and animals. So there was kind of a combination of this long-standing interest in animals with that kind of prodding or suggested from Joan Stambaugh.
So that's really interesting, because it almost brings two of the first episodes in the season together, because we first looked at phenomenology, the idea of how you could even begin to understand another being's experience. And then we started to learn a bit about the world of observations and watching. So what did you find when you started to watch Cat and try to understand Cat's experience in your New York apartment?
One of the biggest things I would say is that I tried to, and Cat really showed me the way, and that's a motif we can talk about later that comes up in, I think, a lot of the best ethologists and philosophers who are concerned with animals, is that it's really important to let animals show you the way. The more you come to the observation with predetermined set of behaviors or expectations, then the more likely you are to miss things or not to let the animals exercise that initiative. So I tried to, as much as possible, kind of bracket those expectations and see what Cat was doing, what Cat was showing to me. And one of those things was that even though we were cohabiting using the same space, and we would even use some of the very same spaces like the desktop or the couch top or whatever, there were some real differences in the way that Cat would use those surfaces compared to the way that I would use them. And on the one hand, they made for, happy overlap. On the other hand, it made me aware that, even though I didn't ordinarily lie down on the desktop, that was something that, Cat enjoyed. And when it comes down to it, that was just as valid a use of the desktop as setting books there or setting a computer there or something like that. And there was a big example of that in my kind of first piece about this Toward Cat Phenomenology from 2000, where when I was writing the piece, Cat came and walked and then sat down on the keyboard for a period of time, and it entered all these letters that are, from the formal English syntactic point of view, doesn't really make sense. But on the other hand, it's an index of this movement and gesture and impression of Cat using that surface, that space of the keyboard. And if I think back on it, that was probably a germ or point of departure for me for thinking about some of these issues about art, because that was a index of gesture, which is something that's really, important, current, perhaps in all artwork, but certainly in deciphering, understanding a lot of 20th century artwork, it seems. So anyway, sorry.
So what do you mean when you say index of gesture?
I mean that those seemingly random letters or seemingly nonsensical letters entered into that piece that stay in the form of the printed form of the piece are an index of that movement or an index of that lying down by Cat. They're an index or they're an encapsulation of that act by Cat. And it's also a demonstration that although we privilege this kind of semantic, symbolic usage of the keyboard for our purposes of exchange of linguistic information that we utilize, there's other forms of use of the keyboard that in some sense are equally as valid,
That's beautiful. So there are different ways to experience the keyboard, and just because it's not in a way that's producing a coherent sentence, it doesn't make that experience any less valid or I don't know, beautiful. You use the word useful there. I don't know. I think that's quite an interesting word, because you spoke earlier, with art being a thorny issue when it comes to understanding the relationship between humans and animals. And part of me, again, might come down to my lack of understanding with art. What is the use in understanding art generally, and also in understanding how and why animals produce art?
Oh, that's a big question, and it might. I'll try my best. It might go beyond my expertise, because even in the preparing for this interview, I've been reviewing some of the sources of people who have engaged this topic seriously, and one of them we can talk about in more detail after is Desmond Morris, who happened to be both. Well, he's still alive, so I should say happens to be a very well-known ethologist. Very well-known zoologist, but also kind of the last of the living surrealist painters who knew Picasso and Miro and these kind of folks, and who also worked with this chimpanzee Congo who drew and painted. And even I consider him to be someone who has a lot more expertise in this area than I do. And even he, on his writings, will kind of balk out or back off from questions like this. But it's an important question. And I should say, I meant to say before, you were saying that you're not an artist. And I should say also that I'm not an artist, really. I don't have that background of the plastic, visual or musical arts per se. The reasons why I've been both fascinated by this kind of activity in animals, but also I feel like it's been a learning experience, or I've tried to lean on or borrow experience from other people who I think are more, have more knowledge or more kind of like direct facility in that area. But in terms of that really important question about what's the importance about understanding art and animals producing art, on one hand, I would say that in terms of the importance of understanding art, I might resort to that kind of famous line or idea in Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, where he's trying to describe art as something that he really believes is coterminous with life itself, and that exists in every kind of instantiation where you would find life, from the kind of supposedly the most simple to the most complex. And he's taking issue with a kind of a kind of view of aesthetics, or a view of art that I think was current in his time, that saw art as kind of very separated off from everyday life and a special kind of aesthete category unto itself. And he has that evocative line where he says that life is not a readily dispensable tinkling of bells that accompanies life, but art is something that's integral to life itself. And in some sense, that's something that comes up like a refrain through a lot of the folks who have engaged this issue of animal art seriously, like Morris, like Étienne, Souriau, and other people we can talk about, that this issue of, whatever you want to call it, presentation, performance, even dissimulation, fabulation, these things seem to be deeply present within the natural world. And so I believe that not only, I'm inclined to agree with Nietzsche that there's something important about art in terms of understanding life itself, just in terms of a deep relation between art and life. And then beyond that, there's the ways in which art figures life, or art takes up questions of life, or takes up difficult questions of life, or progressive questions of life, and is able to figure them. So that's my attempt at an answer about the importance of understanding art. On the one hand, I'd kind of refer to an element of that same idea, which is that if art really is coterminous with life itself, and if it really does exist from the simplest forms of life to the most complex, then we as humans have been really missing a lot of things in taking a too restricted view of art, especially one that restricts art just to human art makers. And we've probably, just like we could have known about, but we kind of ignored animal language or animal culture for a long time because we simply didn't believe it existed. We probably ignored or overlooked a lot of, really vibrant, important aspects of animal artistic production. And then at another level, or related to that, I would say that in general, the very name of this podcast, right, is The Animal Turn, and it refers to a kind of a wholesale reevaluation of our attitudes and our knowledge about animals, which has been taking place across the disciplines, scientific and humanities and social scientific. And one of the things I think that had created a kind of a blockage or a difficulty is that we had a pretty strong set of assumptions about the non-existence of agency among other animals, or the strongly instinct-based action or reaction of animals versus the expression of creativity and novelty in existence and in interaction. So I think that really trying to pay heed to animal artistry or animal art making goes part and parcel with this general shift towards being more cognizant of animal agency and being more cognizant of animal activity. One of the people whose work I've tried to draw on, who's been influential for me in looking at this, is an Italian philosopher and biologist named Roberto Marchesini. And he believes, first of all, that, like we were referring to at the beginning, all human art-making activities are really animal activities, like forms of movement, forms of gesture, forms of marking. So he believes that everything that humans do as art makers is really an animal activity. But beyond that, he believes that all human art, once humans emerged as a supposedly distinct species, he believes that all human art was formed by the extensive imitation of other animal activities. He calls it zoomimesis or theriopoiesis. So he believes that all human dance and performance and painting and sculpture and everything is grounded in this careful observation and imitation of animal activity, non-human animal activity.
So are you saying that it's not just that animals produce and create art, but that humans are animals and as such we produce art? Or are you talking about we view the natural world and animals as inspiration for art?
All of those things. But yes, absolutely. One is that animals produce art. Two is that humans only produce art as animals, and that all of human artistic production in one way or another can be read and deciphered or interpreted as an animal activity. And then third, also exactly like you're saying, that humans use the activities of other animals as an inspiration that informs human artwork.
So to maybe make this a little bit more tangible, do you have an example? So you spoke about cats leaving a gesture. Mm-hmm. Do you maybe have another example of an animal producing art?
Sure, I do. On the one hand, okay, let's take two of the kind of classic examples from the 1960s. One I referred to already is this chimpanzee Congo, who worked with Desmond Morris, the ethologist and painter Desmond Morris. And he wasn't the first chimpanzee to do this type of thing. Desmond Morris catalogs a lot of other instances going back at least till like around early 1900s. But Congo, especially during his early years, really loved to draw and then to paint. And Desmond Morris would work with him, give him a pencil or give him paints, and he produced like 400 of these drawings or paintings. And like we were saying, since Desmond Morris was both an ethologist and a painter, he was kind of uniquely situated to pay attention to this. And he compared these productions of Congo to other human artists of the time. And they even presented some of those drawings and paintings of Congo to psychologists or art historians at the time. And they, without saying that they were the product of a chimpanzee, and those psychologists and art historians immediately thought they were human artworks. And in fact, it's very opportune in a way that we're doing this interview right now, because it ended up that those artworks of Congos were exhibited in a show, an exhibition in the Institute for Contemporary Art in London. And it just so happens that at the very same day, there was another show at the Senate House Museum in Kingston, New York. Both of those, that was also of chimpanzee artists in the United States, like from Baltimore and other places. Mm-hmm. Both of those shows opened on September 17th, which is tomorrow, 1957. So that'll be the 63rd anniversary tomorrow of these shows. And as you might imagine, those artworks and those shows were met with a kind of a combination of reactions. Some people, I guess, thought it was cute, both, in both cases, because that was kind of the early era of television. Several of those chimpanzees involved had been featured in regular kind of TV programs, both here in the US and in Britain. So on the one hand, there was a kind of a cutesy factor. And then on the other hand, some people took it as a confirmation that modern art itself, even as practiced by humans, was bereft of any kind of creative meaning or long-term importance. But then on the other hand, there were painters and artists and art historians who were really interested in this artistic production by chimpanzees and what it seemed to represent about their relationship to the world and their way of moving around in the world. And there was one art historian who worked with Desmond Morris named Mervyn Levy, who was a kind of a well-known art critic or art historian in Britain, kind of in the middle part of the last century. I think, he lived up till 1996 or so. And he, just at that time, was interested in comparing those chimpanzee works to the so-called action painting or abstract expressionist, or in Britain and France, sometimes they called it Taschism instead of abstract expressionism. Mervyn Levy was interested in viewing those works side by side. And there were some shows that, shows that would put side by side these chimpanzee artworks compared to works that were like in the vein of Jackson Pollock, for instance, where both of them were supposed to be, records of movement, recordings of gesture. But in any event, they kind of showed that there was this interest, sometimes dismissed interest, but also a serious undercurrent in thinking about the way that these non-human animals would make artworks.
That's fascinating. And I know when I was reading about Congo myself, that they would say he would throw tantrums if a painting was taken away from him before he felt the painting was done, or that if he was finished with it and someone was trying to compel him to paint more, he would refuse, which I think maybe speaks a bit to the experience of animals in producing art. Could you elaborate? Do you have any sort of sense of what some animals go through while producing art? Is there a joy? Is there a sense of achievement?
That's another really excellent question. And that's really something noteworthy that you mentioned about Congo, that he seemed to have this, I forget the exact word that Morris uses, but this, absorption and this intensity in the practice of making that artwork. And just like you said, he didn't want to be interrupted. He wanted to continue doing that activity as long as he could, or as long as he wanted to. And really crucially, he would prefer to, and this was the case also with some other chimpanzees like Alpha or Jody and some others, the similar kind of work, they would prefer to keep being engaged in their artwork to feeding. So even if they were offered, food that they ordinarily would take almost automatically, they would defer and they would refuse the food until such time as they were done with their artwork.
Wow.
And that seems to speak to something like a joy, something, like a real intense state of being engaged in that activity.
It does make me think a little, though, because another article that seemed to come up quite regularly in reading about animals and art was these elephants that paint paintings in zoos, and that to some extent, some zookeepers have tried to, create artwork or the generation of art as a means of helping elephants cope with the stress of living in a zoo. But that what some researchers who recently went there found was that this art didn't dissipate their stress. In fact, their stress levels were exactly the same. Do you think, in thinking about animals creating this art and what kind of, or who is producing this art, often it's captive animals or animals that have been in one way or another trained to produce art, does that take away from the beauty of the art, or I don't know if I'm articulating this correctly. Is there something to consider there in terms of how the art is produced?
Absolutely, and that's another really excellent question. I'm glad you asked about that for a number of reasons. One is that's a really important example about the elephant paintings, and another one of the people who I've really drawn on a lot for knowledge in this area is my friend Vinciane Desprez. And she has considered in different locations these very questions about like whether it's valid to speak of animals as artists, and what are the differences between animal and human artistic production and this type of thing. And she has a book called "What Would Animals Say If We Asked Them the Right Questions." It's a abecedary, so like 26 sections, one letter each. And one of them the first one actually has to do with artists. Are animals artists? Is it valid to call animals artists? And in that section, she considers this very example about the elephant artists and the elephant painting. And she actually responds to Desmond Morris, who was one of the people who had gone to Thailand. And I don't think he was involved in the studies about the elephant stress, but he was one of the people to go to Thailand and to report that supposedly these paintings are not original because the trainers are kind of cueing the elephants by movements on the ears to produce certain paintings, or to produce each movement. And I'll talk about the stress in a moment. Vinciane's response is very interesting because she says that for her, well, first of all, she says that she herself had witnessed a different performance of this type in Thailand, in northern Thailand, as opposed to the location in southern Thailand where Desmond Morris went. And the location where she went, there wasn't this same kind of cueing by touching the ears of the elephants by the trainers. And so either she says it's the case that there's another form of training, or it's a different issue or different set of issues at stake. But she says that even if it's the case, she kind of takes issue with Desmond Morris's almost dismissal of the undertaking, because he says that, basically he says these paintings are fakes because the elephant is drawing them, but it's being prodded by the trainer. And Vinciane instead chooses to read that as a cooperative artistic enterprise that's taking place between the elephant and the human trainer. So for her, it's a more complicated set of questions. And it's not that the animal doesn't have artistic ability or artistic, even desires, but there's something more complicated is going on, which is a more cooperative or relational kind of undertaking. And she says that she believes that she takes issue with that pronunciation of Desmond Morris that these are fakes, because she says it kind of that dismissal kind of contains these prejudicial notions that humans are the ones with creativity, animals aren't, and this kind of thing, whereas she's interested in looking for those openings of animal creativity.
In her critique there, though, in calling it a collaboration, and maybe this comes back to the idea of stress, would that not also maybe be undermining some of the power dynamics between a trainer and an animal? To what extent does choice come into play when generating art?
Well, that's an excellent question. And choice, like intention, has been one of those kind of central features that people have proposed as one of the things that really shows that humans only supposedly are able to make artwork. And that's a very good point. I think that the direct term that she uses, I said collaboration just now, I know, but the direct term that she uses, I think, is combined assemblage of the human and the elephant. So in that case, it's more value neutral in a sense, or I mean, it's still open. That doesn't foreclose the analysis of those power dynamics that are definitely there. And this, a complicated set of power dynamics, because these elephants are elephants that had been used in labor for logging in Thailand, but then the government banned the use of elephants in forest logging. So the elephants became unemployed. Many of them simply died because they weren't fed anymore. So a lot of this undertaking was an undertaking to try to maintain the well-being or generate revenue to feed these elephants or to house these elephants. So there's a complicated set of power dynamics kind of nested in this. But it's a really good question. And something else I was going to say in relation to your very question about this is that you're right, because also even in the example of Congo and the other chimpanzee artists, it was fairly regimented type of expression. And there's another side of this, which is some of the artists, that I was lucky to collaborate with, and some of the indications, kind of the way pointed to some extent by Vincent Desprez or Dominique Lestel and others, which is that there's another set of this, which is not necessarily trying to get animals to reproduce what we recognize as human artistic forms, but trying to pay heed to the type of expression that animals make that if we, open our blinders a little bit, we can see as artistic production if we don't constrict that view based on some, tightly bound prejudices of what constitutes a work of art.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because it seemed as though in considering animals and the experience of aesthetics or of art, that it was kind of this constant reproduction of paint on canvas. Can an elephant paint on a canvas? Can a dolphin paint on a canvas? It seems to be this constant repetition of that, whereas that feels like it would be a form of art, or at least artistic expression, that would come up in a very specific place, one in which there is a human to maybe create and generate the canvas needed and the paint needed. But like you say, what of the arts that animals produce and appreciate in their own environments? Do you maybe have some insights on what that might look like?
Sure. And that's a really good point you're making too about painting, because even if we just restrict our kind of view to the human only, like anthropocentric discussion about art, there's myriads of discussions about whether painting itself has been exhausted and whether painting has any other place even within human production. And so and even if we figure it in the panoply of human artistic production, it's one of the media among others. And then, like I say, there's all these discussions. Has painting been run through? Is it finished? So you're right. It's peculiar that this, even on human terms, kind of restricted domain becomes such a privileged domain, like a litmus test to force these animals to undergo to proclaim whether or not they're artists. So you're right to speak about expanding the envelope and types of things that animals are doing that that it should be viewed as artistic production. In its own right. I was referring to these kind of like two kind of sources or important sources from the 60s. One is Desmond Morris, who, because of his training and because of the type of work he did, is concerned with primates. But there's another French source from the 60s, Étienne Souriau, a philosopher, and he wrote a really important book called Le Sens Artistique des Animaux, The Artistic Sense of Animals. And he goes well beyond the primates in terms of looking at many different kinds of like artistic production among animals. And he spends time looking, for instance, at things like at spider webs or termite mounds or wasp nests or other bird nests and those type of things. And he says, he draws a number of important conclusions about them. One is that he says that, like, if you take, either of those examples, like the spider or the termite, for instance, he says that in those instances, there's a really important development from an artistic point of view, because the work that is produced is separate from the producer, separate from the artist. He talks also about many different forms of what he believes are art, among the plant realm, flowers and that type of thing. Talks about orchids having the ability to imitate wasps, mimic wasps, so that they draw the wasps for pollination.
I've just finished reading A Foray into the Worlds of Animals by von Uxel. And he speaks about tones, and he often speaks about how, was it a bee, where he'd say how an animal has a counterpoint, how they end up producing what's around them. Anyway, I'm rambling.
No.
I'm not good enough to articulate what I'm trying to say here, where he's just saying that beings produce what's in relation to them in their environment. But even what you were saying about architecture, we'll look at human architecture as art and say, wow, that's beautiful. And to consider a wasp's nest as, architectural art, I think is awesome. We think of cakes as food art, to maybe look at the honeycomb as beautiful food art, collaborative food art, I think is a really, it's a wonderful thing. But are we just playing semantics here? Are we just playing with words, or are we really challenging the idea of how animals and humans experience the world?
I don't think we're just playing with words, because that's really good points that you make, that from just a sheerly architectural point of view, things like the wasps' nests are quite impressive, both in terms of the ratio between the weight of the materials and the strength of the structure, not to mention the regular repetition of forms and the ability for the expansion or adding on to the structure. There's some really amazing undertakings there, or like you say about the honeycomb. And I don't believe we're just playing semantics, because on the one hand, I think that distinction that Souriau makes is really important about the work versus the maker. And sometimes that gets overlooked. He says, and so does Desmond Morris too, that like this kind of threshold of figurative art or representational art is oftentimes posited as a real dividing line. But in some ways, that's not, it's not as important as it might appear to be, because just like we were saying about painting, representational art itself was retreated from in the 20th century. It was no longer the marker of, sine qua non of artistic production. So that separation between what's made and the maker is important. And Souriau makes another important distinction I think is important, which is that, well, he too, like many others writing in this area, recognizes that the over influence of mechanism was a real drawback to our being able to pay heed to animal capabilities for a long time. And one of the ways that played across in this area is to view all types of animal actions, like making nests or making webs, as purely instinctual and something that was just like pre-programmed. But Souriau makes the point that actually, even though there's certain conditions that seem to be met in terms of the orientation of the web and that type of thing, in fact, there's a great deal of innovation in the placement and the construction of the web that can't really be accounted for by a mechanistic and instinctual account of these things. And I find that persuasive, and it also dovetails with something else that Italian Roberto Marchesini says that I was mentioning before. And he says that kind of simple account of stimulus and response and instinct has always been wrong in these kind of general biological accounts, because he says even if it's the case that there's a kind of phylogenetic heritage of kind of like so-called responses that an animal has, he says that the animal will always be confronted with novelty in each and every situation where it's actually reacting to something. So he believes that there's always an element of an interpretation, and there's always an element of novelty or creativity, even in those responses that we take as we used to take as instinctual, but now we see as more open-ended or more kind of interactional with the world.
For sure. And to your point, in the last episode, I spoke to Carl Safina about animal culture, and he gave some really beautiful examples of how you will have the same species of animal, but in different groups and in different locations, using different tools or engaging in pretty complicated but different relationships. And for him, he's just started to say we have to consider animals' culture. And of course, a critical part of culture and how we've come to understand human culture is the art that we've produced, the relics, the artifacts. So I think you raise really critical points there. So I'm just going to switch gears a little bit here. Something I came across while preparing for this interview, which piqued my interest a little bit, was the idea of copyright. So there was a series of really famous pictures that came up in about 2014 of some monkeys taking selfies. And the guy, David Slater, he kind of trained them how to take photos of themselves, but not really trained. I think he just showed them how it's done. And these became really famous images. But he was not able to claim ownership of those images. And actually they're on Wikipedia Commons as images anyone can use. And I'm just curious if you've thought at all about copyright and the ways in which animals experience and artifacts are valued.
That's another really excellent question. And it has to do with some of these same fault lines we've been looking about attribution of creativity, attribution of agency, and then also what are, human symbolic or legal structures versus what are, systems of life or something like that. And that's a really good question, because at some level, it seems like if we're, well, maybe not some level, just in general, if we're taking animals seriously as artistic producers, as art makers, then they have to be entitled to the ownership or the I guess copyright of their works. But I think it depends highly on the jurisdiction. I don't think, maybe New Zealand, I'm not sure, but I don't think there's very many jurisdictions where there's a legal precedent that will recognize that kind of ownership right for a non-human animal. Now, there are people arguing, probably correctly, that should be extended, that it's part and parcel with the notions of animal Bill of Rights. So it's a really important kind of, burning question. And I know that, I'm sure you were talking about Congo. So you know that many of Congo's pieces were sold because there was such an intense burst of interest from that show in 1957. So most of the pieces were sold. And I'm not, I think that those pieces benefited the zoo where Congo lived. And so indirectly, in some sense, they probably contributed to Congo's upkeep. But I don't think that Congo had a copyright. And I don't think he really got all of the money, And
I thought it was an interesting thing because it ended up tying back to the idea of legal persons, saying that animals cannot own art because only legal persons can have copyrights, which I thought was really interesting. And it kind of got me thinking a little bit about the idea of art and possession when we're trying to think about how animals experience art, whether it's a bowerbird, making an incredible nest, or display, or whether it's the honeycomb. To what extent does ownership or possession play a role in animals' experiences of art?
That's a huge one. You ask such excellent questions that have so many important facets to them, and it makes me think of a number of things. One is that. Okay, I'll try to be brief, but the one is that I was thinking when you asked this about copyright, I was thinking about two of the artists that we were really fortunate to collaborate with during the last years of their life, and who both really actively collaborated, not in a window dressing sense, but like throughout the real main line of their work, really collaborated with animals, especially felines. And that's Karelis Neyman, who is kind of usually best known as a performance artist, but really who identified herself as a painter, but who saw all kinds of other like movement and sculpture as kind of outgrowths of painting or an expansion of the canvas, which is maybe one clue to a way that we could expand the canvas to admit other kinds of animal activity that doesn't subject them to the type of expectations that we bring to it, like we were speaking about before. And then the other artist is Agnes Varda, the French filmmaker. And both of them really foregrounded this idea of animals, cats as artists. Carolee Schneemann had a famous film from, I think it's 1968, called Fuses. And she identified that film, in that film, she identifies her cat Kitch as the director. And there are three personages listed. There's her, James Tenney, her partner at the time, who's also a composer, and Kitch. And she always, that's an important film in a lot of ways because it's kind of like a feminist pornography, but it's even before the discussions about the male gaze or the female gaze and that type of thing. But she's already playing with that idea of the gaze, and she believed that the gaze of the film was the gaze of Kitch. So it kind of deactivated this, or like got around this other, presented a different angle on the erotic dynamic because she saw the film as being shot from or directed by Kitch. And she also has we did a show of with her work of that her cats had done, that our cats had done. And one of the pieces that she donated for that show was this painting that Kitch had made in 1959 by picking up a shoe brush and making a mark on a paper. So it was kind of in dialogue with those paintings by Congo and all that. And I bring all this up because she clearly foregrounded Kitch or other cats of hers like La Niña or Vesper as artists and as artistic producers. She also believed that they should be able to own the copyright. But she realized that the legal system prevented that. So she was very assiduous about making sure that she, Carolee, asserted the copyright over those things, because she saw herself as a collaborator with those animals, and she didn't want them to be. She could always make sure to attribute the agency or the artistic creativity or role of those animals. But she realized that was kind of a compromise because the best solution would have been for the copyright to be directly owned by those animals. And I think that Agnes Varda, from discussions with her, had a similar kind of idea. And one example that I see for that is that her production company and the logo of her production company prominently accentuates or features a picture of her cat Zhugu, who's in a number of her films. And I believe that she also, in a way, saw Zhugu as a kind of producer, an actor. And if the legal frame had allowed it, I think she would have registered the copyright for some of her works in the name of the cat. So you're right; it relates to this question about personhood, and it's kind of a underhanded argument that ends up making a pretty strong push towards that notion for personhood and ownership. Mm-hmm. There's another question you asked, which is about the role of ownership towards art. That's a really good question. Some people say that even, supposedly sophisticated human artists don't really care about the ownership of their artwork, and it's the activity which is important and not the object itself. But then there's another interesting aspect to this, which has to do with, I guess, perception and contemplation, I guess. And there's a famous picture of Congo contemplating one of his works. And we had a piece also in that show, the cat art show with Karelis Neyman, where one of our cats from the Center for Feline Studies, Quatrina, was contemplating this landscape. And there's another philosopher we've been drawing on for this named Jean-Marie Schaeffer, who's developed a theory of aesthetic experience and also an account against human exceptionalism, such that he clearly believes, like others we've been talking about, like Roberto Marchesini, that aesthetics and art making is something that's grounded in the animal realm at a level well beyond humans, and that there's this process of contemplating and observing artworks is grounded in a type of perception and cognitive faculties that we have as humans only because we're mammals or only because we're part of the animal realm. So we had a piece of Quatrina contemplating a landscape that seems to dovetail with his account about the way in which we look at things or consider things if we're contemplating them rather than just looking at them or taking them as part of the accoutrements of a room or something like that. So it's not exactly ownership, but it has to do with that relationship to the object. Last thing is there's a lot of discussions about the overcapitalization of the art world and whether or not any artwork should be owned per se, or whether or not that's pernicious, because there starts to be this incredible inflation of the value of the art, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the conditions of production, but I can leave that aside for now.
No, it's infinitely fascinating. And, you know, you're speaking about a cat contemplating a landscape or an artwork, and then, you know, there are two voices in my head. On the one hand, I'm saying, how can you possibly know that the cat is being contemplative? And on the other hand, I've got an image of my companion dog Linus sitting with his nose up in the air, experiencing wind in a way I've never experienced wind, like a genuine appreciation for what wind is bringing with it, the smells, I don't know, someone who's walked by, and you can just see that he's appreciating it. But that's not a very sophisticated argument, is it, to say, I can see he's appreciating it?
It kind of goes back to von Uxküll in a way, right? Because what's so powerful about that is it's a radically non-anthropocentric vision, right? It's an acknowledgement that there's all of these animal worlds, or like concatenation of animal worlds, only some of which we really have entree into, because we ourselves have our own limited sensory envelope. And so we're trying as well as we can to try to get some sense about how your dog is appreciating that, or what the cat is seeing. But we come up against these limits of our humanity. So that's one of the other things that's so powerful about this domain, is that it illustrates the level of our humanity. Whereas in general, we seem to believe that the human envelope is almost infinitely expansive, and that certainly it's larger and more expansive than the animal envelopes. But in these instances, we see actually that's not really the case, right? We have our sensory, and kind of phenomenological envelope, and so do other animals. I can read you really quick a quotation from Jean-Marie Schaeffer about this very...
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so he's talking about his account is rooted in cognitive science and rooted in perceptual science. So he's saying, like, he's arguing, Étienne Souriau does too in a different way. He's arguing that there's this aesthetic experience, but the aesthetic experience is something that we have because we are animals. So it's something that's rooted in these deep processes of cognition and perception that we share with many other animals. He says each time, this is what I thought of when I was thinking about Congo looking at his work, or Quattrino looking at this landscape, says each time that I approach something in the frame of aesthetic attention, I transform that to which I direct my attention into a mental landscape in which I take a walk. I go from a logic of serially organized monofocalizations pre-focused by the perceptual task to accomplish into an attentional dynamic without assigned task, welcoming numerous points of potential attention grabbing that become as many points of simultaneous focusing. And he's talking about the visual here, but it seems like smell-wise, it kind of relates to what your dog was doing.
Yeah, and I think, what's not to say that animals can't, we've spoken a number of times here about, like, what is art and what is not art, but again, to continuously bring it back to how we've defined art would maybe be a mistake. If art is a product of, cultural dimensions, then it's maybe what would be aesthetically pleasing in those particular cultures. How can we think about the ways in which particular animals or particular groups of animals experience their worlds? And what could we infer about beauty in their worlds, or appreciation in their worlds? I saw, I don't know where it was, but years ago, I think, an image of dolphins making bubbles. They would spin, and then they would form bubbles, and there would just be juveniles forming bubbles and playing with these bubbles. But there was clearly an appreciation of the bubbles and learning from one another on how to make these bubbles bigger or bolder or more beautiful. And and I don't know, like, there's a relationship there between play and art, which I think could be really illuminating for understanding animals' experience.
That's a lovely example. And you're right, a fantastic example, because on the one hand, it's something they're biologically equipped for, to make bubbles and that kind of thing. But it's not just a routine activity that they're doing. And it's just like you're saying, it's an activity that's subject to manipulation or change based on these aesthetic factors or these play factors. And I think that's really important because talking about the manipulation and the play, those are also kind of watchwords for open onto creativity and agency and intention. And it reminds me that, that's one of Morris's kind of criteria that he presents for art based on this work with Congo and other chimpanzees. He says that I forget what he calls it, but he says it's self-rewarding. That, there's no, like, it's not because you're going to be given a piece of fish or something like that. There's no other reward. The reward is in the undertaking itself. There's an inherent fascination in it. And I think there's something to that comes out in that example of the bubbles or that way that Congo was so wrapped up in the artistic work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it disrupts some of the ideas of ownership that we were talking about. There are many ways in which one can value art. Capital or money is one way, but self-appreciation and fun is maybe another. We are slowly coming to the end of this episode here, and I feel like we're just getting into the groove now. It's really so interesting that once you start to get these examples in your mind. But I know that you read a quote not too long ago. Do you have another quote that you'd like to read to kind of sum up what you think about aesthetics or maybe the work of someone who's inspired you?
Sure, absolutely. Let me just say, well, actually, the quote does relate to this, but I just wanted to say, because you brought it up several times in a really lovely way, that you were talking about this kind of difference between aesthetics and art. And you're right, you made a useful distinction between them a minute ago, that they're related to one another, but it's not exactly the same thing. And in some way, that's what's beautiful about this approach of Jean-Marie Schaeffer. I was just mentioning Étienne and Souriau. They're talking about a deep aesthetic sense in animals. And also they believe there's an artistic sense, but that you're right, that sometimes the discourse about art has gotten mired in these detours about saying what is or what isn't art. And we know there's been terrible examples of that in terms of human art, ruling out certain kinds of religious art or non-Western art as if it wasn't art. Anyway, so that's a really useful distinction or something to think about, is the relation of aesthetics and art. And
well, I should have maybe asked this question right at the beginning, but could you maybe give us as simple as possible a differentiation between aesthetics and art?
Oh, goodness. I'm not sure if I can, although I would say that I'll rely a little bit on both Schaeffer and Souriau here, that aesthetics has to do with like a deeper sense of the way of seeing and relating to and contemplating the world, and that art, the production of objects or activities, can grow out of that sensibility, but that the aesthetic sensibility is more primordial in a sense, and that I think you have to have an aesthetic sensibility to have art, but you don't necessarily.
So art is almost the object, whereas aesthetics is maybe the experience of, or the feeling and creation of it.
Yes. Even allowing that, like you were saying, there can be non-objective art or performance art, the dolphins with the bubbles. But if we take that as kind of an object or a temporary object, yes. So There's a beautiful quotation from Étienne Souriau from this book, The Artistic Sense of Animals. And he's talking about these animal productions, and he's kind of anticipating these kind of naysayers or objections. And he says, there's no point in asking if it is aesthetic or not. It is by definition, if I may say so. Or more exactly, it is to define an aesthetic sensibility rather than to speak of an intuitive appreciating sensibility as the best form and more or less perfect aspect of success of the work. So he wants to contest that kind of instinctual form, that the animals only produce these things by instinct, and he wants to argue for something else, which he says is an aesthetic sensibility, which is not just innate, but is related to the modes by which the animal interacts with the world. And he has one other quotation that kind of resonates with that. This is from a different book called the Different Modes of Existence. And he says, each incipit or kind of work in this sense or object of the always novel melody of existence. And by the way, this has to do with Uxkol also, right? Because Uxkol makes this musical analogy. So he says, each incipit of the always novel melody of existence represents something surprising and always admirable, the local success of a trial in the art of existing. This art supposes, as we have seen, that a precise mode of existence was found and used. This is beautiful because it folds together evolution in a larger sense and this process of aesthetics and art making.
Yeah, that is quite beautiful, and I did love, like, Varda really brought the idea of melody and bells and composers. It was quite clear that he had some of his own worldviews shaping that. But yeah, I like the idea of a melody, and you mentioned their evolution, which is not something we really touched on here, about the idea of evolution and aesthetics. And I know, I have it in my notes here somewhere, that there was a word of, I think it's like aesthetic evolution, that there's this idea that it is something that's just evolved, but to maybe be cautious in framing humans as being at the top of some sort of weird evolutionary tree.
That's an excellent way to put it, I think. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you see that certainly, like in Morris, for instance, he's fascinated by the works of these chimpanzees, but he's constantly comparing it in a developmental sense to human artwork. And I'm more interested, I mean, I guess I approach things, what you might say is a naive point of view. It has to do with the issue about intersubjectivity and the issue about artwork. I kind of approach it from the point of view, like Heidegger's response to Descartes, whether there's like a mind and world. It's like we're already in the world. In that point of view, I think it seems evident there's already intersubjectivity and there's already animal artwork. So I'm more interested in the kind of the plane of immanence from Spinoza and Deleuze in that sense. And in that respect, it it seems to me that we're already alive with these possibilities. And you're right. Then in that case, if we construct these hierarchies where we put the human at the top, we end up missing out on all this varied and beautiful aspects of animal art making. And we kind of, and that very same dispute exists in evolution more broadly. Like, just because humans have a certain type of development, does that mean that we see humans on the apogee of the evolutionary totem pole? And most people nowadays say no, we have a certain niche or a certain adaptation, but it doesn't mean that humans are superior. We're, just like Uxkal again, we're inferior to other species in a lot of ways in terms of perception or movement.
Right. Wow. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. But if anyone's interested in the work you're doing, or do you perhaps have another animal arts exhibition coming up anytime soon, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on and where people could learn more about you and your work?
Thank you very much for that invitation. We do plan to have other cat art or animal art exhibitions. There's none planned in the immediate future. I guess, for one thing, the pandemic has been interfering with that type of thing. But we do certainly plan that. And unfortunately, the artists I mentioned that we collaborated with, Agnes, Varda, and Karelis Neyman, have passed away. But also partly as a result of their deaths, there's been a renewed interest in the role of animals in their collaboration. So we definitely want to extend that, and I'll definitely publicize a show like that when it happens. Other than that, I'm interested in continuing to explore these very same themes that we've been discussing along the lines of some of the same animal producers and the same human compatriots or thinkers we've been talking about, and trying to pay heed to this area, which, like we were saying, is both ancient and perennial, but also kind of new or hasn't received the kind of attention that it seems like a very important area. And there's a ton that emerges once you start to scratch the surface, like we've been doing.
Yeah, for sure. I think once we got more into it and the more we spoke, the more I just kind of got excited about it. And it took me back to the first question I asked you about the usefulness of this. And the so what question is a terrible question because it's a bit of a, it's interesting, and animals and understanding their experiences is worthwhile, certainly. If people want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
They could email me. I have bussolini@gmail.com.
Okay.
And that's probably the best way. And it's been a real pleasure. I appreciate your reaching out to me and being able to have this conversation with you, Claudia.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for being here and for being so generous with your time. I hope you have a lovely evening.
You too. Thank you. And say hi to your dog for me, please.
I will. All right, and that's it. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for being with me today on the episode. As always, a huge thanks to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics for sponsoring this podcast. A huge thank you to Jeremy John for the logo and to Gordon Clark for the great bed music. Next time, I'm going to be speaking to Catherine Gillespie, and we had a fantastic chat, lots of laughs, but lots of really important insights into the significance of intimate geographies in understanding animal experience. I hope you'll join me then. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Herzenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.